Welcome to the video for lesson 2 of the Trust Faith study. This lesson is entitled Trust, Freedom, and Obedience. And we're going to discuss how learning to trust God will help us to find what true freedom is and how we can actually find it in obedience to God's commands. So we're going to look at God's goodness and authority. We're going to talk a little bit about obedience and a couple of elements of it. We'll look at the call to obedience, the freedom and the blessings of obedience, and then we're going to finish off with a story from the life of Abraham and look at his obedience. But again, as we come back for the beginning of this lesson, we're going to gather together, talk about how things have gone since the last lesson. So tell us a little bit about what you're expecting to hear from our participants.
Well, we're definitely reinforcing that accountability of taking that time to reflect on the areas that you might be struggling to trust in God. So we're looking for our participants to come back having done it and even choosing a scripture that spoke to them. So we're hoping that they come having done it and sharing, but you need to be prepared as well as a leader that you've chosen a scripture yourself that spoke to you and helps you grow in your trust of God. And also that you've chosen an area, like a mini testimony in a way of an area that you currently are struggling and where God is like stretching you, or from the past, like something that you used to struggle in. Brief and relatable, but to be ready at hand to contribute to that sharing time, because if our participants come and haven't had anything to share, then that's you. then it's on. You need to be the one to model that. And I would encourage you as well as a leader just to take the opportunity there and say, it's really important that you guys come kind of ready to share and having done the challenge, because we need it. We build off of that every week. So it's that steeper call. I see that as this lesson kind of weaves together trust, freedom, and obedience. Those are 3 big words. How are we linking them? What are we doing?
For many people, these are going to seem like they're very opposed to each other.
Yeah.
Right? And for many of your participants, they'll come in when they hear the word freedom, what they're going to think is lack of restriction. And that's kind of the typical modern view of freedom, is that we think it's the freedom to do whatever we want, whenever we want, without any exterior or external restrictions being placed upon us. But that's not how the church sees obedience. The freedom that clearly plays into obedience. And so we first want to point you to, there's some great notes on page 47 of your leader guide. Make sure to review those. But in brief, what you're going to see there is that these really are linked together, because true freedom in the church's mind is the freedom to be able to pursue the good, to be able to pursue perfection, to be able to live as we're intended to live. That's where we will actually find true freedom. It's not in having no restriction. It's actually living as we were intended to live, as God has created us to live. And to be able to do that, then, if there's an intended way for us to live, there's also going to be ways that we're not intended to live. So there will be restriction. And really, freedom with no restriction will ultimately lead to chaos.
Right.
And which will then limit all of our freedom, because we'll have chaos around us. And it will prevent us from pursuing the good. So we want them to understand freedom in this light of it being about finding our true intended purpose for life. And there's an analogy I heard a professor use once, and I think it's really apt to describe this. And he said, imagine I have a guitar, and if he handed it to me, I can't play the guitar. And so I'm free in the sense of I have no restriction, so I can pick it up and I could try to strum on it, but I won't make music. I'll just make noise.
Right.
And I won't be using the guitar for its intended purpose, which is to make beautiful music, to play a song. He said, now, if you hand that to a skilled guitarist, they have real freedom, because they can actually pick up the guitar and play it for its intended purpose, and they can make that beautiful music that we all enjoy. And the point here is that, which one really has the true freedom? It's the person who knows how to use, in this case, the guitar for its intended purpose. And for us, in the same way, that we can live our lives in the modern way of freedom and just kind of do whatever we want and have no restriction, but we won't be living the way we're intended to live, which means we won't actually achieve the purpose of our life, which is ultimately holiness, perfection, and union with God in heaven. And so if we really want to achieve the purposes for which we were created, we have to live out of this freedom that really does include some restriction, because it's actually pointing us towards what we're actually intended to live.
I love that. I love that imagery. it's so transferable, right? It can really help our
Mhm.
leaders if they're struggling in that section to come back and watch this again and practice it, because that's a really great analogy.
And so as we're looking at this idea of goodness and freedom and all that, we're going to start with in this section on goodness and authority with a quote from the Catechism that refers to how we call God as Father, and that when we do that, it really has two meanings. That it talks about that He is both good and He's the transcendent authority. So talk to us a little bit about why we touch on that.
Yeah, I think our participants need to, well, we're assuming nothing, and we want to really begin by establishing like an important understanding of God. And because we cover His goodness and His authority, we're looking for them to know, okay, He is good. So if He is good, then I can trust His intentions as He designs what He designs for me and calls me to what He calls me to. I know that His motivations are good. And as authority, we're helping reframe for our participants what that word authority means. And they might have some negative connotations to it, but since God is transcendent and he did create us and He knows more about how we were made and what our intended purpose is, I want to trust Him, right? I want to like obey and follow and be abandoned and fully confident and free before that God who made me. And those are important, like kind of misunderstandings or things that our participants really need to get covered right away in this lesson. And it really sets the tone for us to dive into the word of obedience, right?
And so that's where we're going to go next as we start talking about obedience. And this faith study, Trust, was actually inserted into our faith study series to replace a previous title we had, which was called Obedience. So why do we quickly return to the topic of obedience then in just the second lesson of Trust?
I think because we don't want to and we can't avoid this topic. This is like critical in our journey as a Christian, but it's now nestled into this greater context, right? That you've been taking us through in the Trust study, that it needs to be rooted in a relationship of trust with God. And when we trust Him, then we desire to obey Him and follow the laws that He has for us, because His intentions are good for us. So the good that He intends is the good that we actually want and the good that we need. And I think participants maybe have like a trigger about that word or like a misunderstanding, and it brings right away, some fears, right? And we are tucking it in here after talking about trust because the context is more fitting.
And I like how you talk about we can trust in God's law. And so even at moments where maybe we aren't certain if we're in full agreement with it, we kind of revert back to the trust in God. And then our obedience is not just out of a kind of a begrudging obedience of like, oh, I guess I just have to do these things because God said so, but actually being able to look at it more from the perspective of, well, God is my good and loving Father, and He actually knows what's best for me. And so when He sets up a law, it just makes sense for me to follow it because He really does know better than I do. And so even though maybe I'm not certain right now why this rule exists, or if I even fully agree with it, that out of an abundance of trust for God, I will follow. And I think that can, as you said, kind of reframe our understanding of obedience into its proper context, which is that God isn't meant to be a tyrant. He's meant to be a loving Father who's showing us the way towards perfection.
No, it's beautiful because it is a challenge for our participants to fully understand all the things about the faith. That some of our areas, misunderstanding church teaching or areas of sin, can come from misunderstanding, and we're limited, right, in our human understanding of things. But God, who is transcendent and who has designed, is trustworthy. So we don't have to wait until we fully understand. We can be invited to trust as we seek to understand. And I think that's really transformational for a lot of where they're at in their growth with Him. Yeah.
And that's very much what Abraham experiences, right? Is that he has to grow in his trust. And we're going to take a look at this, as we close the story from Abraham, is that, and if you know the story of Abraham, you see, and this is often something I'll share with the participants as we talk about this, because we'll read this story. This is the story of Abraham and Isaac.
Yep.
And it's a great story of trust. And we want to look at it in this context of trust. But we can look at that and maybe it feels a little bit unrelatable because we figure, well, Abraham, he's Abraham and I can't trust like him. But if we actually read the whole story of Abraham, he fails over and over and over again in his trust, and God has to continually correct him and re-invite him to trust in the plan that He has instead of Abraham trying to do it on his own. And sometimes that can be really helpful for participants to kind of get that context so they can see maybe more of themselves and where they could be as they continue to grow. And so then we look at the story of Abraham, and you could talk about the story for hours from so many different layers. But the context here is to talk about it in relation to trust and seeing how Abraham has now grown into such complete trust in God that even when God asks him something that he can't understand, and something so so deep in him. This is his son. This is the son that every promise that was made to Abraham was going to be fulfilled through Isaac. And then God says, sacrifice him. I can't imagine what was going through Abraham's mind at that moment. This must seem crazy. But he'd grown to the point where he could say, Lord, I trust you enough that I will follow. And I know that you will work this out for the good. And of course, this is all going to the characteristics of God, that he's good and that he knows what he's doing, and he knows better than we do. And Abraham demonstrates that to us, and we want our participants to see that. And we see that even in his language, that when Abraham will say things, when the servant says to him, he says to the servants, wait here while my son and I will go over there to worship, and we will return. Not I will return, but
Right.
we will return. He's showing already just in that language a trust that's there. Or when Isaac says to him, where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And he says, God will provide, knowing full well that what God instructed was to sacrifice Isaac, but his trust in God is so high. And so we're trying to get our participants there. But then we have in question 11, and it's a secondary question or a follow-up question that's there in your leader notes, but it's a really important one where we bring in a bit of a transferable concept when we ask our participants to consider what are their Isaacs. And when we use that term, your Isaac, we mean what are those things that maybe are really hard for you to trust God with, hard to let go of, and to kind of put in God's hands and trust them to Him. We all have these things, and by putting this term to it, it makes it, it always relates it back to this story, so that you can ask this now in your accompaniment, say like, so is this an Isaac? And that will recall the story, but also it provides an easy language to continue your conversation, both you and your participants, and even amongst themselves.
Oh, definitely. That vocabulary becomes like I love how you said that it cuts right back to the story, and they know kind of what we mean. And we would encourage you in your intentional accompaniment in this lesson, both that you would be prepared as a leader, thinking, what do I, like through prayer and observation and accompaniment, what do I think might be some obstacles, some Isaacs, some fears that my participants might have? Because as you're aware, you can then set the tone in this question. You could say examples like, for some of us, we might struggle with fear of what people might think. We might struggle with our popularity, our status, some idols that we're aware of that are generic and that we all struggle with, but that you're intentionally sharing because it might be some of the ones that are in the group, and invites them to then respond and to share, yeah, that is one for me, and this is one for me. And we hope that sharing is happening. But in the challenge, where we're asking them to choose one way to prayerfully consider this week where they might hesitate to trust God, like in their evening prayer, you can ask them, like literally ask God, right? What is an Isaac in my life? What is something that's limiting me and where I'm holding on tightly and I'm uncomfortable to bring you in and let you have control and authority here? A tip that I've given to some of my participants is not only just to take it to their evening prayer, but to Mass. That as we prepare for Mass, sometimes well, what do I do? I'm here and that's awesome. This is the highest place of prayer. So as you're arriving to Mass, just casting vision for your participants, this could be a place where you imagine yourself laying an Isaac on the altar today at the Eucharistic celebration, that if there's a theme and a really hard struggle, or just something that happened that morning that's really hurtful and hard, that they could be that intimate with the Lord in their conversation. Say, I'm laying that down today. I'm giving you control here. I know you'll take care of me. I'm going to let go of my control in this way. So those are two tips maybe for your intentional accompaniment as you close this week.
So this lesson really does invite us into a new perspective of what it means to have trust in God and the relationship between freedom and obedience. We want them to see, our participants to see, that this is where they're going to find the greatest freedom in their lives, is when they trust in God. And that's going to lead them to a place of understanding that His intentions for us are good, and that He wants to bring us to a place that will ultimately lead us to perfection, that will lead us to what we were created and how to live in the way that we were intended to live. Obedience is not meant to be bowing to a tyrant who just wants to control our lives, but it's actually submitting ourselves under the care of a good and loving Father who also really knows what's best for us. And if our participants can walk away from this lesson with that understanding of what it means to obey God, and to have that understanding of how to link it to freedom and to trust, then we've really helped them move forward a long way in their faith, and that's going to point them towards how they'll really find true joy and true fulfillment in their lives.
That's so true.
So that wraps up lesson 2. We'll look forward to talking to you again for lesson 3.